like to talk to you tonight about the first Thanksgiving. And as a historian, I always like to give a little bit of a background, and sometimes I give a lot of a background. But I want us to look at the history of the world. How would you like to look at the history of the world? I'm going to take you through the history of the world in a nutshell tonight. Imagine back in the Roman Empire period of time. So we have the Mediterranean Sea down here. You have North Africa here. And for those that are listening by radio, I have a big map up here. You have all of Europe. And the Roman Empire controlled it all. Then they began to get overrun with illegal immigrants. They were the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Lombards. They were overrunning the Roman Empire, coming across the Rhine River Valley. At first they came across slow and assimilated. They would learn the Latin language, and they were working as servants in the households. And matter of fact, so many Eastern European Slavic people came down that the word Slav took on the connotation of a servant. Today we pronounce that word slave. That's where the word came from. And then, after a while, these Eastern European people, these different tribes, came so fast that they didn't have time to learn the Latin language. So they kept their own tribal languages, their German language and their Anglo's language and their French language, and it broke up the unity of the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, Rome had its military stretched all around the world, putting out global fires, fighting in the Middle East, fighting in North Africa, fighting up in Britain. Then they were having terrorist attacks. Attila the Hun was going around wiping out whole cities of 75,000 people. Meanwhile, they had the whole city of Rome was on welfare. They were giving away free bread. One historian said those that live at the expense of public funds are more numerous than those that provide them. And they had to raise taxes to pay for the welfare programs and to pay for all the military expenditures. Meanwhile, they had outsourced all of their grain production to North Africa. It was the grain basket. But when the Vandals, and believe it or not, that was the name of one of the tribes that overran the Roman Empire, the Vandals, and they came through Spain, they went into northern Africa and captured it and cut off the grain supply, so Rome didn't have resources to mount a counterattack. And then the people of Rome had gotten into moral debauchery. I went to school for 6 months in Rome, and we would tour the homosexual bathhouses, and they would have jacuzzis, but under the floor would be the place where they'd stoke the slaves would be down there stoking the fire to keep the jacuzzis bubbling. And they had gymnasiums, and of course you think, what's wrong with a gymnasium? Well, gym is the Greek word for naked, so a gymnasium was where a bunch of naked men ran around, and the Jews and Christians that were circumcised wouldn't go there, and for obvious reasons. And Pompeii, remember that place that was buried under the ashes of Mount Vesuvius? We toured there. I don't necessarily recommend it, but they still have on the walls the murals in the different rooms for the specialties that the different prostitutes did. The place was debauched. That's why God let it get destroyed with Mount Vesuvius. But this was Rome. They had a practice called exposure of unwanted infants, where a mother would bear a child and lay it at the father's feet. If he picked it up and inspected it and liked it, they would keep it. If not, she had to get rid of it. And would put it out in some pagan temple or out in the woods, and the early Christians would hear these babies crying and gather them up, and many of them became great preachers. So Rome was falling from the inside. A historian named Salvian in the 5th century said, "The Goths lie but are chaste. The Saxons are savage in cruelty but admirable in chastity. What hope can there be for the Romans when the barbarians are more pure than they? O Roman people, be ashamed of your lives. Let no one think otherwise. The vices of our bad lives have alone destroyed us." So I just wanted to start you off with that little encouraging talk there. So y'all... Anyway, after Rome fell, there was a power vacuum. And the church filled part of that in certain areas. But in other areas, there was no organization. There was no government, no police, no nothing. And then the eastern part of the Roman Empire was called Byzantine. And it had been weakened by a war with Iran. They were fighting Iran back then. It was called Persia, was what they called it, but that was Iran. And it had been weakened. And so now we have the Western Roman Empire had fallen, the Eastern Roman Empire had been weakened, and then in 622 AD, we have a person who starts a religion by the name of Muhammad. Muhammad starts his religion in Africa, in Arabia, He couldn't read, so all he knew about Christianity was what he heard from when he'd go on his camel drives. His dad died, and he was raised by his uncle, who was a camel driver. And so he heard about Christianity second and third hand. It just so happens that the area where he lived was where there were a bunch of Christian heresies. There was Nestorianism that said Jesus was all God. There was Arianism that said Jesus was all man. There was the Ebionites that said you had to be poor and had to be a Jew before you could be a Christian. As a matter of fact, Muhammad was married to his first wife by her uncle, who was an Ebionite Christian priest. And anyway, Muhammad couldn't read the Old Testament. And so he heard just word of mouth. But see, they had the Old Testament, and then they had the Talmud, which was the written commentary on the Old Testament. Then they had the Midrash and the Mishnah, which were oral commentaries on the written commentaries on the Old Testament. So what he heard about the Old Testament was second and third hand removed. And then besides, Arabia was the seat of paganism. They had hundreds of different gods that they worshiped there in Mecca. And the most popular was the moon god, whose name was Allah. And so Muhammad mixed all this together and came up with his faith. And he had it broken into two houses. There was the house of Islam and the house of war. The word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. And you're going to see in a moment how this is going to tie into American history. It's a very important point. America would not be here, so we got to pay attention. So Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is somebody who has submitted. And they think there will be world peace when the whole world has submitted to the will of Allah. So Islam is a peaceful religion. But their definition of peace is world Islam, when the whole world has submitted to Allah. And then the other is the house of war, or the house of jihad, which is in the process of becoming the house of Islam. So they see the world as Muslim and going to be Muslim. The difference between a violent Muslim and a peaceful Muslim is the moderate Muslim thinks Islam will conquer the world, just not during their lifetime. So why get all bent out of shape? Get along with people, right? It's not going to happen for a long time. Well, the violent Muslim thinks that Islam will conquer the world during their lifetime, and they want to help make it happen. I sort of say there's three groups of Muslims. There are the violent ones. There are the ones who are afraid of the violent ones. And then there are the dead ones who weren't afraid of the violent ones. In other words, everybody talks about this large group of moderate Muslims, but the moderate Muslims will not speak out and condemn the violence. Why? Because every now and then one does speak out, and they put out a fatwa against them and kill them. So the whole religion is held captive by the small group of violent ones. Anyway, during his lifetime, Muhammad went and waged 66 battles. He went into Quraysh, and he cut off the heads of 700 Jewish men and then sold the women and children into slaves. All along North Africa, there were 250 Catholic dioceses. And this is prior to the Reformation, so just about all Christians are Catholic. The Muslims wiped them all out. All of the Middle East was Byzantine, Christian, and Jewish. And in 636 AD, the Muslims swept in there and conquered all of that area. And then they conquered all of Spain and held it for 700 years. Then they conquered all of Asia Minor and turned it into Turkey. The Muslim Ottoman Turks. How many of you read the last book in the Bible? The book of Revelation, where the Apostle John writes a letter to the church at Philadelphia, to the church at Sardis, to the church at Laodicea, the Thyatira, all these different churches. Guess what? Every one of those churches was wiped out by the Muslim invading Ottoman Turks. The Muslims came in there and wiped out those churches. They had a unique way of doing it. They would capture a Christian city and take the young boys from the Christian homes and put them into the Muslim army. They called it the deshurva, which meant the blood tax. Or, they would capture an area, they'd tax everybody. Oh, you got to give us some food, and you got to give us some of your animals, and you got to give us your kids. And so they would collect the young boys, put them into the Muslim army. They were called janissaries. And a janissary was an elite fighting force. And as soon as they were trained to be armies for the Muslims, and they surrounded the Sultan, they were his special guard. And as soon as they converted to Islam, they got to have a weapon. So they didn't get the weapon until they actually converted, and they all did convert. The Muslims got to wear full beards, but the janissaries could only have a mustache. But they would put the janissaries on the front lines to attack the next Christian city. So they were using the children of Christians to attack the next Christian city. So that way they wouldn't have any loss of life. I mean, that's a pretty good idea, right? Use your enemies' kids to attack your enemies. Sort of like maybe the way that Christians put their kids in public schools, and then the public schools teach them stuff that is actually against what the parents believe. But finally, in 1452, the Muslims conquered Constantinople. And now this is where it gets interesting. Constantinople was a city that connected Western Europe to the Middle East, to India and China. And so from Marco Polo on, I don't know if you remember Marco Polo. Marco Polo was this Italian, this guy from Italy, that, here's Italy, and on the map. Marco Polo went all the way over with his dad, Niccolo and Matteo. They went through Constantinople, and then all the way over to China in the 1300s. I mean, here's this Italian wandering around in China. He worked for Kublai Khan for 25 years. And but he opened up trade routes from Western Europe to India and China. And this went on for several hundred years until 1452, when the Muslims conquered Constantinople, turned it into Istanbul. It cut off the trade routes. So the Western Europeans wanted to have another trade route to get to India and China. And since they couldn't go the land route, in 1492, this guy named Columbus said, I know how to get to India and China, sail west. And so Columbus would not have set sail if the land route was still there. He thought the islands he discovered were around India. So he named the inhabitants the Indians. He thought that Haiti was Japan. He thought that Cuba was the tip of China. It wasn't until his fourth voyage that Columbus finally admitted he had not found the place. And but if Islam in the 1500s was peaceful, Columbus would have never set sail and America would have never been discovered. So you can sort of see how it's coming together historically wise, right? Anyway, when Columbus came to America, he was a Christian, and he said, it was the Lord that put it into my mind. I could feel his hand upon me. The fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the Indies. And he said, all who heard my project rejected it, ridiculing me. But yet the Lord encouraged me with marvelous rays of illumination from the Holy Scripture. And he came and set up the Spanish Main, which was the Caribbean area. And I won't get into it all, but the word Carib is a Spanish word for cannibal, because they came across so many cannibals there. It was not the paradise that a lot of the politically correct people want you to think. Anyway, we had all the Indians that lived up and down the coast of America at the time. So Columbus opened the door for the Europeans to begin to come to the New World. And then shortly thereafter, we had the Reformation. Now, all of Europe was Catholic. And in 1519 is when Martin Luther started the Reformation. And then princes would start fighting. One prince would say he's Catholic, and another one would say he's Lutheran, and they had all these wars. Finally, in 1555, they passed the Peace of Augsburg. Augsburg was a city in Germany. And it's an interesting piece because it has this phrase in there, Curios et regio, Curios et religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. So it set up this idea in Europe that whatever the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. And so Europe began to break into different religions. In 1648, they had the Peace of Westphalia that went and established this even more. So Germany was mostly Lutheran. Switzerland was Calvinist. Holland was Dutch Reformed. Sweden was Swedish Lutheran. Greece was Greek Orthodox. Russia was Russian Orthodox. Spain and Italy and Portugal and Poland were Roman Catholic. England was Anglican. Scotland was Presbyterian. So in each country, the king decided what was going to be believed in his country. That was the thought. Whatever the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. And the reason this is so important is when we look at we're working our way up to the Pilgrims. Are you still with me? Yeah. I didn't leave any of you back in the 1300s. Okay, let's come up to the 1600s here. And who was the first main group that settled in North America? The Puritans. I'll give you that question there. So, who were the Puritans? Well, it's important to remember. The Puritans were members of the Church of England, which was started by Henry VIII. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Remember, Columbus was sent to America by Ferdinand and Isabella. Well, Ferdinand and Isabella had a daughter named Catherine, and she was married to Henry VIII for 18 years, and she didn't have a son. She had a daughter, Mary, but not a son. So Henry decided to divorce her. The Pope, because this was Catholic at the time, the Pope said, no, I'm not going to recognize that divorce. And Henry said, well, I'll be my own Pope. So he started the Church of England and put himself as the head and went on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. Well, his advisors suggested that if he really wanted to break with Rome, he should stop using that old Latin Bible and get himself an English Bible. Then people would look to England for their spiritual heritage. So for more or less political reasons, Henry VIII spread the English Bible around the country, thinking this will solidify my break with Rome. But something unexpected happened. People began to read it and compare what was in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and being over the church and the corruptions that were involved. And so this group wanted to purify the Church of England. So they were nicknamed the Puritans. Well, the king didn't think he needed any purifying thank you, so he persecuted them. A couple kings later was Charles I, and he hired an archbishop, an Anglican archbishop by the name of William Laud, L-A-U-D. And William Laud sent spies into all the churches to make sure the pastors were following the official Anglican liturgy. And if they weren't, they were arrested. There was an Oxford professor by the name of Alexander Layton, who was arrested by Laud and ordered to have his nose cut in half, his ears cut off, branded on the face as a heretic, whipped twice, and put in the Tower of London until he died. So Laud was not a really nice guy. Laud composed a list of all the leaders in England and put an O or a P by their name. O for Orthodox and P for Puritan. Well, guess what? All the Puritans lost their jobs. They were purged from academia. They could no longer teach at Oxford or Cambridge. I mean, William Penn was expelled from Oxford for having a Bible study in his dorm room rather than going to the Anglican chapel service. And they began to persecute these Puritans. Well, there was another group that said, we're not even going to bother trying to purify the Church of England. We're going to separate ourselves. They believed that the state government should not control the church government. They wanted it separated. And so this group of separatists would meet in secret and in barns and basements by candlelight. And we call these separatists the Pilgrims. The separatists, there was one story where they heard that there was a little bit of freedom in Holland, and so they sold their property, and they went down to a boat in the port, and they all got on the boat, and they were just about ready to take off when the captain went down and robbed them all, turned them all over to the authorities. They threw them in jail, and he got to keep all their stuff. There was another group of these separatists that arranged for a Dutch ship to meet him on the shore. And most of this we know from William Bradford, who wrote the history of the Plymouth colony, who was their governor for 30 years. So the Dutch ship came up on one of the shores of England, and the separatists had sold their farms and their houses, and they were down there, and the men were ferrying out to this boat their goods and putting it on the boat and stocking it all on. While the men are on the boat, the British come over the hill and capture the women and children. And the Dutch captain says, whoops, I'm out of here. And he pulls anchor, and these men are on this boat sailing away. And the wives are like, husband, get back here. For 3 years, they passed those women and children from one court and jail in England to another court and jail. Finally, one of the judges said, look, you didn't really do anything wrong. You were just wanting to be with your husband, so you're okay. Go ahead and go home. They said, we can't go home. We sold our homes. So they said, what are we going to do with them now? So you know what they did? They got a ship. They put the women and the children on the ship, and they sent them over to Holland to be reunited with their husbands. So there was a happy ending to that chapter. Anyway, these separatists were in Holland for 9 years. And as the years clicked by, they saw their children beginning to learn the language and the looser morals of the Dutch youth. And then they heard rumors that Spain was thinking of attacking Holland, which would put them in harm's way. And so they decided to flee again. And at first they were going to go to British Guyana, believe it or not. And then somebody said, well, there's too many tropical diseases in that area, and it's too close to the Spanish Main. Remember I told you about the Spanish Main, the area of the Caribbean? The first settlement in North America was at Fort Caroline, Florida. These were French Protestant Huguenots. That's what they called them. Some guy named Hugo, and so they called them Huguenots, not astronauts. It was Huguenots. Anyway, these in 1565, they had a settlement there by the St. Johns River, which is today around Jacksonville, Florida, for about 2 years until the Spaniards found out about it, and they came there and captured them and made a little truce with them. And then after the men surrendered, they said, oh, we don't have to keep faith with heretics. And so they killed them. They killed 300 men, chopped off their heads, and they took the women and children captive. And so when the separatist Pilgrims heard about this story, they said, we don't want to go anywhere near where Spain is. Let's go to Virginia. So in 1606 is when Virginia was first started. It was a business colony, basically. It was an investment company. There was the London, the Virginia company and the New England company. They wanted to have businesses, trade. I was just up in Maine earlier this year, and they were telling me about the Pine Wars, and Maine was the place where the British got the masts from those long pine trees that they used in all their ships. See, so they saw this as a resource. And anyway, these Pilgrims had intended to go to Virginia. And this is a picture of Holland. This was where they were for those 12 years. And then the Pilgrims prayed and decided to leave. They had a church. They were a church. Now, it's interesting. When they were in Holland, they had their own little Bible church. The churches in England had the king as the head. Even the Puritans saw themselves still within the Church of England, but they were sort of like trying to purify it. But these separatists were over in Holland. They had their own little church, so they came up with a church government where they would vote for who was going to be their pastor. They all had an equal say. They would pray. They would fast. They would work together as a body. So they learned some things that would help them later. So then, once they left, they came to, they left there in Holland, and then they took off from England, and they were coming across the ocean. An interesting story, they first had a boat called the Speedwell, but the Speedwell didn't speed well. And they took off, and it began leaking. Now, the old wooden boats were wood ribs put together, and they would caulk them. They'd try to stick some wax or something. But if the captain let the wind blow the sails too hard, it would separate the seams and water would come in. And they think that's what happened, that this captain didn't want to go over to the New World, and so he sort of did this on purpose, because every time they brought the ship back and looked at it, they hold candles up trying to see a hole, they couldn't see any holes. Anyway, time was clicking by. The Pilgrims were eating half of the supplies that they were going to use once they got to the New World. So they had to switch to the ship called the Mayflower. But now they're sailing later in the season, and there's more storms. So they leave in September. It's a 65-day journey before they finally come to the New World, but they're caught in all these storms. The storms were so bad that the Pilgrims were confined to the between deck, a 4-foot space with no windows. Could you imagine that for over a month of time, being in this little 4-foot space with babies crying? And there was one sailor that was making fun of the Pilgrims, calling them psalm singers and puke stockings, because they would always sing psalms and they were always throwing up. And this sailor suddenly caught ill and died. And so the other sailors didn't speak bad about the Pilgrims after that. At one point in time, the storm cracked the main beam that was holding up the mast. And one of the Pilgrims had a printing press, one of those old rudimentary things with a printer screw. And they stuck it under there and they screwed it back in place and propped the beam back up. And one time, this young man was so tired of the smell, if you can imagine the smell in there, that he decided to go topside to get some fresh air. And he did, and was thrown overboard. And luckily his arm caught a rope, and they pulled him out of the freezing North Atlantic, and he survived, but he never went topside again. Anyway, I'm pretty sure his name was John Howland, but he was the ancestor of many leaders in America, including George W. Bush. And so the Mayflower finally made it to the Americas, but it was blown off course. They were supposed to land in Virginia and be under the Virginia government and walk in and say, okay, well, we're going to just submit to your government. But they were blown off course, and the time was clicking. It was already into November. And the captain said, that's it. We don't have time to go anyplace else. You're going to stay here. And so they get off the boat. But before they get off, they say, wait a second. There's no government for us to submit to. So they decided to come up with their own government. And they called it the Mayflower Compact. This is the first government document written in the New World. Now, I've read through all the charters of all the states, and I actually put together a book called The Original 13. And I have read through every charter of every colony, every state constitution of the 13 states, and all the amendments up to the present. And then wherever they mention God or faith or Christianity, I put it in here. It's an amazing book when you see the history of each of the 13 states. So when these Pilgrims came across, every other charter says King Charles I grants permission for you to have this colony. King James I grants permission for you to have this colony. King George, II grants permission for you to have this colony. Well, this was not the king granting it because there was no king on the boat, so they granted themselves. They said, we, the hereby undersigned, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith a voyage to plant the first colony on the northern parts of Virginia, do form a civil body politic. And so they mutually covenanted themselves together under God. And this was a revolutionary idea. It was no longer the king granting them permission to have a government. They were granting themselves to form a government under God. This was the first government document made in the New World. This was the blueprint for several of the other colonies, specifically Connecticut. And then Connecticut's constitution was the blueprint for the U.S. Constitution. You see, Connecticut had an established denomination of Congregationalism. And it was this church government where the people got to vote for who their pastor was going to be. And they got so used to doing this on a church basis that they said, let's do this for our government officials. Because we don't have a king. The king's 3,000 miles away. He can't appoint every little person. And so they decided to vote and elect themselves. They covenanted together, and then they voted. And so that was the blueprint for the U.S. Constitution, which starts off that says, we the people of the United States of America. I mean, you read Canada or Australia or some of those others, it's, they still acknowledge the monarch. The Queen Elizabeth or whatever. But ours starts off, we the people. We grant ourselves, which is an interesting concept because we're the king then. In America, the people are the king. And so when things are bad in a kingdom, and you walk in and you see this king's all upset because all these bad things are going on, and you say, King, what's going on here? All these, they've got servants are raping and beating up each other, and so aren't you? And the king says, I wish somebody would straighten this out. I wish somebody would stop all these terrible things. And you're like, you're the king. You're the one that's supposed to stop it. Well, guess what? In America, the people are the king. And so when there are bad things going on, the king needs to fire some of his servants, some of his public servants. You need to get rid of the bad ones, and you need to put in some new ones. But the king is responsible. We're responsible. And anyway, the Pilgrims write the Mayflower Compact, the first government document done in the New World. And here it is. It says, in ye name of God, amen. And then it goes on to say, having undertaken for ye glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony on the northern parts of Virginia. And then they went ashore, and this is where it gets really interesting. Here's William Bradford. He wrote the history of the Plymouth colony. That's another picture of him. And the French and the English and the Dutch used to fish along the eastern coast of America. And they would sometimes lure Indians onto their boat and take them captive and teach them their language and then have the Indians show them where the good fishing spots are. You gotta watch out. Some of those fishermen get a little carried away. And anyway, these Indians became hostile. And so they didn't like these ships from the Europeans coming over. And there were cases where 3 years before the Pilgrims landed, a French ship was shipwrecked right at Cape Cod. And the soldiers, all the sailors got ashore. And William Rederer writes that the Indians never left watching and dogging them till they got the advantage of them, and they killed them all but 3 or 4, whom they sent from one sachem to another, making sport with them and treating them worse than slaves. You see, the Indians, they did have some violent practices. From the 1500s, see, we're talking about 1620 right now. Well, it was 1492 that the Americas were discovered, and it was in the 1500s that the Spanish and the French did send Catholic missionaries in to different parts of America. And there were times when they would capture some of them and tie them up to a post and gnaw the meat off their fingers right in front of them while they're alive. Could you imagine that? They would take bites out of their arm while they're tied up and they can't do anything about it. And so this one guy had his fingers eaten off, and it was wintertime, and he escaped. And for weeks made it through the snow, and finally came back, and then finally got a ship, and finally went back over to Europe. And he met with the Pope, and the Pope kissed his gnarled hands. And then after a few years, he said, "I'm called back to go back to those Indians." And he came back over here and ministered a few more years till he was finally killed. And so these were stories that it was a dangerous place to come over here. They risked their lives. Anyway, so just 3 years before the Pilgrims landed, this French ship was wiped out at that very spot. But something happened. The entire tribe there at the Cape Cod area had been killed by a plague. Now, chances are the plague was because they didn't have immunity to European diseases, which like smallpox and stuff, but nevertheless, they had been wiped out. But lo and behold, right before that happened, one of those ships that stopped by lured one of the Indians on board by the name of Squanto. And he was taken and sold as a slave in Spain. And the story is that he was purchased by some monks, and they gave him his freedom. And he hitchhiked his way across Europe. We're talking the early 1600s. This Indian wandering around Europe gets to England and tries to get passage back to America. But he's in England for like 9 years. And he works. He works as a fisherman and works down at the docks, and finally gets somebody to drop him off in Newfoundland, and then finally gets somebody else to drop him back off on the shores of America. And he gets off right before the Pilgrims land. And he gets off and he sees that his whole tribe had been wiped out. Now imagine how depressed he must have felt. That here, for years, he had been away and he just wants to get back home. And when he finally gets there, it's a ghost town. Everybody's dead. So what does he do? He goes and lives with another tribe. And he's there for that winter. Well, unbeknownst to him, that winter is the winter that the Pilgrims come. And out of all the eastern seaboard, where they could have landed and had Indians that didn't want them there, they land at this one spot where there are no Indians. And so they get off. And that first winter, they begin chopping wood and building their buildings. And the men would sweat, and it would get cold, and they would catch a fever. And they'd keep working, and the fever would turn into pneumonia, and then they would die. One would die, 2, 3, 4, 5, a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, all the way. Half of the Pilgrims died that first winter. They started with 102. By the next spring, half of them had died. Only 5 couples retained their original spouses. And the next couple of years after that, the widows would marry the widowers and put families, sort of mix them back together. And they would not have made it through another year, but that spring, out of the woods walks Squanto. And he comes and talks to them in perfect English. Could you imagine how totally dismayed these Pilgrims were? Here they are 3,000 miles away from civilization. This Indian walks out of the woods and says, "Oh, how are you guys doing?" He goes, "Oh, you're from London? Oh, yeah, I used to live in London." "Oh, the pub down on Wharf Street," or I don't know what. And these Indians are like, And then besides that, this Indian happens to know everything about the area where they had landed. "Oh, I grew up here. Yeah, right on the other side of that hill's a spring. And if you go over there," and Squanto showed him how to catch fish. They said, "Oh, we're trying to catch fish." He says, "We can't do it." He goes, "Oh, spawning season's coming up. You better get your nets ready. You're going to harvest them." Well, they get out there and they just harvest these fish. And then he teaches them how to plant corn. They said, "Oh, we tried planting. We can't do that." He goes, No, what you do, he takes corn and you put 4 fishes over it and guard it for a couple weeks till the fish decompose and fertilize the ground. And you want to keep the wolves from dragging the fish away. And once it's fertilized, they have a great harvest. And then he taught them how to go down to the riverbanks and take the young men in with their bare feet and squeegee in the mud until they get eels, and they catch the eels and they eat them. I mean, you got to be real hungry to do that. But anyway, then he taught them how to take the corn and put it in a pot and shake it over a fire and make what? Popcorn. That's from the American Indians. He taught them how to catch beavers. Now, this is important because nobody ever asked the question, who paid for their boat ride to America? They borrowed money from Thomas Weston for their boat ride to America. It took them 40 years worth of beaver skins to pay off that trip. Think of that. Now, those of you that are in debt, sometimes we think, oh, God can't use me till I'm out of debt. It always seems that God's people are always in debt, but you can't let that hold you back from doing his will. And that's what the Pilgrims did. But the most important was that Squanto put them on good terms with the other Indian tribes. That entire first generation never had any Indian problems. Why? Because Squanto was their interpreter. And a couple years later, in 1622, William Bradford writes that they were exploring another area, and a sleeting, freezing rain began to come down while they're in a small boat. And he says, we couldn't get around the shoals, so we put in at Manamoick Bay and made a shelter on one of the islands. And he says, here Squanto fell ill of Indian fever, bleeding much at the nose, which the Indians take for a sign of death. And he bequeathed several of his belongings to his British friends. And then he prayed and he begged Governor Bradford to pray for him that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. His death was a great loss. This is William Bradford writing this. And he says his last request was he begged the governor to pray for him that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. You see the Disney film and, it almost has him converting the Pilgrims to their Indian religion. No. The Pilgrims were living their Christian faith in front of him, and he saw it, and by the time he was done, he says, I want what you guys have. Pray for me that I go to the Englishman's God in heaven. Well, because Squanto had put them on such good terms with the Indians and taught them how to plant, that first Thanksgiving, that first November, the Indians came and they brought deer and turkey, and the Pilgrims made the food that they had brought, and they had their first Thanksgiving. And it went on for a day. And at the end of the day, the Indians rolled up in their fur skins and just slept on the ground. And the next day, they were still there, so the Thanksgiving went on another day. Those of you moms that have guests over for Thanksgiving, and then the third day they were still there. The first Thanksgiving went on for 3 days, and the young boys had arm wrestling, and they left their bows and arrows outside of the camp. They didn't bring, the chief wouldn't come because he still was a little bit leery, Massasoit, but they had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and that set the tone for it. Now, just immediately after that, another shipload of Pilgrims arrived with no supplies. So these Pilgrims, their second winter, had to take what they had stored and they had to ration to make sure they made it through the second winter. It got so bad that at one point they had to give every person 5 kernels of corn a day. So the next time that you're having a time of struggling with your meals, think of that. And then they made it through that second winter. And then William Bradford talked about how one of the problems they were having was communism didn't work. They had their plot of land, and they were saying, okay, we need everybody to go out and plant. And the one guy would say, oh, I'm sick. And the mom would say, oh, I got this baby, I got to take care of it. Nobody wanted to go out and plant. So William Bradford said, scrap communism. Everybody gets their own plot of land, and whatever grows on it. Everybody's out there saying, okay, I'm going to plant. And she got the baby on the hip, and she's planting. And that next year, they had a huge harvest. And so that year, in 1623, they had their first Thanksgiving where they actually had a proclamation for it. And we see that this was the beginning. Now, other colonies were formed, but they were what's called royal colonies. And they didn't try to set up their own government. They were just appointed by the king, and they just did what the king wanted. And if you look at the history of these different colonies, If you see the coast here, each colony was founded by a different group. So Virginia was founded by the Church of England. In its charters, which I have in here, it talks about how all the churches need to follow the ecclesiastical laws of the Church of England. So in Virginia, they chased out the Quakers. They wouldn't allow the Quakers in there. Massachusetts was started by Puritans. The Puritans wouldn't allow the Quakers in there either, but they wouldn't allow the Anglicans. And then Roger Williams fled Puritan Massachusetts. See, it's interesting, if I can explain it. Is everybody still following me? The Puritans in England, they didn't like the church government being controlled by the state government. They didn't like the fact that the king would send spies into the churches. You know, they didn't want their church being controlled by the state government. But once these Puritans got to America, 20,000 of them came across. We just had 102 Pilgrims, but 20,000 Puritans came across. They settled in Massachusetts. Once in Massachusetts, they realized they were the government. And so they felt, well, maybe it's not such a bad idea that the state government controlled the church government, because we can make sure that the churches don't get off into heresy. And so you had Roger Williams was a pastor that came across from England, and Roger Williams was preaching that the state government should be separated from the church government, and they didn't want that to happen. And so the General Court of Massachusetts sent soldiers to the little church that Roger Williams was at and kicked him out from being pastor and chased him, so he went and lived with the Pilgrims for 4 years. And then Roger Williams came back to Salem, Massachusetts, and was the assistant pastor at a church. And then when the pastor died, he became the main pastor. Well, the General Court of Massachusetts again sent there saying, we don't want you to have him as your pastor. And the people said, well, we're going to choose him anyway. And so the General Court says, okay, well, if you do, we're going to basically excommunicate your town. You can't do business, you can't buy land, you can't do anything. And so even Roger Williams' wife was saying, look, you're getting a little carried away with this. And so they were going to arrest Roger Williams and send him back to England. And 3 days before they arrested him, he fled. And he fled and founded Providence, Rhode Island. And he founded the First Baptist Church in America. And there in Providence, Rhode Island, he has word that Massachusetts was going to annex and take over Rhode Island. So he goes to England and gets a charter. But one of the unique aspects of history is that you had to get the king to approve. There wasn't any king, because those Puritans that were left over in England had a civil war. Oliver Cromwell was their governor, and they captured the king and they chopped off Charles I's head. So there was no king in England. The Puritans controlled it. And so Oliver Cromwell was the king, was the Lord Protectorate, and his Secretary of State was Sir Henry Vane. So Sir Henry Vane signed the charter for the colony of Rhode Island, which did not require the church to submit to the king. So it was a unique charter. And so Rhode Island was a colony that was predominantly Baptist. And it was unique because all the other colonies had requirements for faith, but this one didn't. And that's because they understood that true religion was from the inside out, not forced by the government from the outside in. And but anyway, so Roger Williams gets word that the Massachusetts General Court that chased him out was led by John Cotton, that John Cotton was trying to defend what he said. And so Roger Williams says, well, I'm going to defend my stand. So when he's in England, he writes a letter called the Bloody Tenet of Persecution for Conscience Sake. And then he writes another letter where he criticizes John Cotton. And I want to read a portion of this because it shows up in some of the other places in our country's history. That he's over in England and he writes this. He says that John Cotton overlooks a very important point. He says the church, first, the faithful labors of many witnesses of Jesus Christ existing in the world, abundantly proving that the church of the Jews in the Old Testament is the type and the church of the Christians in the New Testament is the antitype. but both are separated from the world. And when they have opened a gap or a hedge in the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broken down the wall, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness, as it is to this day. And that therefore, if he is ever pleased to restore his garden and paradise again, it must necessarily be walled in peculiarly unto himself from the world. And that all that shall be saved out of the world and transplanted out of the world into the garden of his church, a separation of the holy from the unholy. Now, did you catch that? There was some terminology in there that I want to comment on. This is Isaiah chapter 5. It says, My well-beloved hath a garden, has a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. And he fenced it and gathered stones thereof and planted it with the choicest vines and built a tower in the midst and made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and behold, it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray thee, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done? And he says, And now go tell, what will I do? I will take the hedge away, and it shall be eaten up, and I will break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is Israel, and the men of Judah are his plant. And he looked for judgment, and instead found oppression. So, we have this analogy that there's the garden of the church, and it's walled or hedged in from the wilderness of the world. But if the people sin, God will allow the wall or the hedge to be broken down, and his church will be trampled. But if the people repent of his sins, God will rebuild the wall separating church and state. This is the analogy that Roger Williams, the founder of the Baptist Church in America, because he had been the pastor of a church, and the wall had been trampled down when the general court came in and said, you can't be the pastor. Now, the reason this is important is because this was in the year 1644. Well, in 1801, Thomas Jefferson writes a letter to who? The Danbury Baptists. And he says what? He says that believing with you that religion is something between man and his God, and the legislative powers of government reach to actions only, not to opinions, thus showing that there's a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson is talking about this, what? Wall of separation between church and state. And who's he talking to? He's talking about it to these Baptists. And what are the Baptists? Their whole denomination was founded in America based on this concept that they didn't want the state government controlling their church government. They wanted a wall around their garden to protect it from the wilderness of the world from trampling on it. So Jefferson understood it, and the Danbury Baptists understood it, that this wall of separation was to keep the government from coming in and telling the churches what they can and cannot do. Is that making sense? And Jefferson explains himself. I wrote a book called Backfired, and I actually put Jefferson's quote in here. In 1808, Jefferson writes this to Samuel Miller. He says, I consider the federal government as prohibited by the Constitution from intermeddling with religious institutions, their doctrines, their disciplines, or their exercises. He says this results not only from the provision that no law shall be made respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, but that which reserves to the states the powers not delegated to the federal government. That's an important point, because the first 10 amendments were the states limiting the power of the federal government. And he says, certainly no power to prescribe any religious exercise or to assume authority in religious discipline has been delegated to the federal government. It says, I do not believe it is in the best interest of religion to invite civil magistrates to direct its exercises, its disciplines, or its doctrines. Every religious society has the right to determine for itself the times of these exercises, the objects proper to them according to their own particular tenets. What's Jefferson saying? He's saying the federal government is prohibited from intermeddling with religious institutions. Why? He's saying there's a wall, and the federal government can't step over the wall and tell the churches what to believe. Why? Because that's exactly what King George III did do. King George was the head of the church, and he was the head of the state, and King George says, look, this is what you're going to believe, and if you don't believe the way I tell you to believe, you're going to be thrown in jail. And the Baptists didn't want that, And Thomas Jefferson didn't want that. So he says the federal government is prohibited by the Constitution from intermeddling with religious institutions, their doctrines, their disciplines, or their exercises. Do you get a picture of what separation of church and state used to mean back then? It's totally different than today, where they say you can't mention God, or you have to teach pornography and all kinds of other stuff because of separation of church and state. No, back then it was to keep the state from coming in and telling the church how to run their church business. And anyway, so each state, each colony began to get formed. So it was the Dutch Reformed that founded New Amsterdam, which became New York. It was the Swedish Lutherans that founded Delaware. It was the Congregationalists that founded Connecticut. It was the Puritans that founded Massachusetts. It was the Baptists that founded Rhode Island. It was the Quakers that founded Pennsylvania. It was the Church of England that founded Virginia and Carolinas. Maryland was unique. Maryland was founded as a colony for persecuted Catholics. But they were ahead of their time. They gave tolerance to any Christian. And more Protestants got elected than Catholics and voted them out. And they had to wait till after the Revolution before they could have their first church in Maryland. But it got to the place where there was tolerance in America for all Protestant denominations. And one of the things I did is I read through all of the early state constitutions. And I just want to take a moment here and read you just a sampling of these to give you an idea. So each colony had its own preferred denomination, and they didn't get along very well. You had the Virginia Anglicans chase out the Quakers, and the Quakers went to Maryland, which had been ruled by the Catholics. Once they got to Maryland, they said, we don't think in our conscience we can submit to Catholic leaders, so they took it over and they kicked the Catholics out. Well, then you had, in New York, was Dutch Reformed. They didn't like the Lutherans, so they chased the Lutherans out. You had so it took them a long time to learn how to get along with each other. But finally it got to the place where they tolerated all the Protestants. And so here is the charter for Georgia in 1732. It says, and all persons except papists shall have a free exercise of their religion. Well, what's papist? That's papal, that's Catholic. So it's saying everybody except Catholics can have a free exercise of their religion. This was Georgia in 1732. Did you know, and I wrote the history of each colony, there was not one Catholic in the entire state of Georgia till after the Revolutionary War. Why? Because they were forbidden by their colonial constitution. Here's New Jersey's. And then 98% of the colonists were Protestant, and about 2% were Catholic, and about 0.1% were Jewish. Here is the state constitution of New Jersey in 1776. It says, no Protestant inhabitant of this colony shall be denied the enjoyment of any civil right. Did you catch that? Here's North Carolina's state constitution of 1776. It says, no person who denies the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion shall hold any office in this state. Here's Vermont's state constitution of 1777. Nor can any man who professes the Protestant religion be justly deprived of any civil right. Here's South Carolina's state constitution of 1778. The Christian Protestant religion is hereby deemed the established religion of this state. Here is Massachusetts state constitution, written by John Adams. It says that the state may lay a tax for the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety and religion. Did you see anything in common in there? The word Protestant. So before the Revolutionary War, it was only tolerance for Protestants. And then, when the war happened, the Catholics, the 2% Catholics, fought side by side against the king. And so the rest of the country said, look, if you're willing to bleed and die for our freedom, you deserve the right to be able to go ahead and practice your religion here. So after the Revolutionary War, Catholics began to be tolerated in America. There were actually 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. One was Catholic. His name was Charles Carroll. He was the richest man in America, and his cousin started Georgetown. He had another cousin, Daniel Carroll, that signed the Constitution and donated the land that our U.S. Capitol is built on. And anyway, John Carroll was the one that founded Georgetown. He had grown up in Maryland and went to Europe, became a priest, came back to Maryland, and since there was not one Catholic church in the whole state, he started one on his mother's farm. You see, Protestants back then didn't think that somebody could be loyal to the Pope and loyal to America. But John Carroll was such a good patriot, the Continental Congress sent him to Canada with Ben Franklin to try to get that French Catholic country of Canada to join us in the Revolution. Well, Canada didn't, but John Carroll made such a good impression that 4 states changed their constitutions to allow Catholics to hold office, and eventually they all did. And they did this by saying all you had to do was be a Christian. For example, here is Maryland's state constitution of 1776. No other test is required to hold office than an oath of support to the state and a declaration of belief in the Christian religion. Here is South Carolina. All denominations of Christians in this state, demeaning themselves peacefully and faithfully, shall enjoy equal religious privileges. Here's North Carolina's state constitution of 1835. 1835, that's quite a time into our country's history. It says, no person who denies the being of God or the truth of the Christian religion shall hold any office in this state. Here's Delaware's state constitution. I love this one. It says, every office holder shall make the declaration, I profess faith in God the Father, in Jesus Christ, his only Son, the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Now, I don't know if you're still awake or if you caught that, but that sounds like an oath to join a church. But that was an oath to hold office in the state of Delaware. Now, we read that today and think, man, they were so narrow-minded back then, saying only Christians could hold office. Guess what? They thought they were being very generous and progressive. And in fact, they were as compared to Europe. Because in Europe, you had to belong to a particular denomination of Christianity in each country to hold office. In England, they passed the Test Act of 1673, requiring all office holders to be Anglican. In Germany, it was Lutheran. In Switzerland, it was Calvinist. In Italy, Spain, France, and Austria, it was Roman Catholic. In Holland, it was Dutch Reformed. In Scotland, it was Presbyterian. In England, it was Anglican. So they said, look, in our state, all you got to do is be a Christian. It was the most generous in the world at the time. And here's Pennsylvania's state constitution, signed by Benjamin Franklin. Frame of Government, Chapter 2, Section 10. Every office holder shall make the declaration, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. What's that? They had to acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. In other words, they not only had to lay their hand on a Bible to swear into office, they had to swear they believed in the Bible in order to hold office. Which sort of makes sense. What good would it do to lay your hand on a book you didn't believe in? I mean, you may as well swear in on a cookbook, open it up to spaghetti or something. I mean, it's the idea that you're calling a higher power to hold you accountable to perform the oath you said you're going to do. And then the next thought that comes into our mind is, well, wait a second, what about separation of church and state? How can they require people to be Christian to hold office if there was separation? Easy. Back then, separation was simply keeping the federal government out of the state government business. I mean, that's what the first 10 amendments were. They're saying what? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Congress shall not take away the right to freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Congress shall not take away the right to possess and bear arms. Who is limited by those amendments? Congress. It doesn't limit the states, and it doesn't limit the people within the states. It limits the federal Congress. In other words, they wanted to make sure that we didn't have a repeat of Europe, where the federal government chooses one Christian denomination as the official denomination and enforces that on everybody else. My wife said it's still a little complicated, try to make it easier. So I came up with this analogy. See if you can follow it with me. Imagine when every colony was founded, they had their own restaurant chain that had a monopoly. So Virginia had Church's Fried Chicken. That was the only restaurant chain allowed in the whole colony. And Massachusetts had Boston Market. And New Hampshire had Red Lobster. And that was the only restaurant chain allowed in the whole colony. They had a monopoly. But once we rebelled against the king, the head of the Church's Fried Chicken chain, then Virginia began to allow some other restaurants to open up, have a little competition. But Boston and New Hampshire and Connecticut didn't. They wanted to keep their state monopoly. But the only thing they could all agree on was they didn't want the federal government to start a restaurant chain and like a Walmart town and muscle everybody else out of business. They didn't want the federal government to follow the example of Europe and set up one denominational headquarters in the White House. So that's what the First Amendment says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It could very easily say Congress shall not establish a restaurant chain or regulate the restaurant business of the states. Did you see that? How many followed me on that? Okay, so we see that you drop a pebble in the pond, the ripples go out. So first there was tolerance in America only for Puritans. Then it went out to Protestants. Then it went out to Catholics. And then in the early 1800s, it went out to liberal Christians like Unitarians and Universalists. I mean, they were a minority within a minority, very small, but they quoted from the Bible, they talked about Jesus, and so they got tolerated as a liberal Christian denomination. And there's only 0.1% Unitarian Universalists in America today. And then in the middle 1800s, do you know that the first Jews to hold office in America was in, I apologize, I'm messing up this microphone here a little bit, but you can still hear me, can't you? The first Jews came to America in 1654. Now remember Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the ones that sent Columbus to America? Right? They sent Columbus to America. They had a daughter that was married to Henry VIII, right? Ferdinand and Isabella. Well, Ferdinand and Isabella drove the Muslims out of Spain. Muslims had controlled Spain for 700 years. After they drove the Muslims out of Spain, they decided, we'll drive the Jews out. So they drove the Jews out of Spain. The Jews fled to Portugal. And they were there for a generation, and then they were forced to flee again, and they went to Holland. And with the Dutch, the Jews went around the world. And 700 of them went to Recife, South America. And they had a thriving colony there until Spain decided to attack there. So they fled again. And 23 Jews on a ship, St. Catherine, arrived at another Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, which later became New York. Well, the Jews got off the boat, and the governor of the colony was Peter Stuyvesant. He would not allow them to worship outside of their homes, would not allow them to have a synagogue, would not allow them to have a cemetery, would not allow them to vote, would not even allow them to volunteer for the militia to fight the Indians. Why? Because it was a Dutch Reformed colony. They didn't tolerate the Lutherans or the Quakers. They certainly weren't going to tolerate the Jews. So it was not until New Amsterdam became New York that the Jews were allowed to have their very first synagogue in America in 1730. But during the whole colonial period, there were only 7 synagogues in America. One in Newport, Rhode Island, one in Richmond, Virginia, one in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, one in Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. During the whole colonial period, there was about 3 million people in America at the time of the Revolution. There was 1,500 to 2,000 Jews. It's less than 1%. But in 1830, something happened. There was a persecution of Jews in Bavaria. And 250,000 Jews came across, and they were embraced and given asylum in America, and they began to be tolerated. So the first colony to allow Jews to hold office was Maryland. It was in 1826. Thomas Kennedy spent 8 years of his life fighting to give Jews the right to be able to hold office. He was not a Jew, he was a Presbyterian, but he fought to allow them to hold. And then in 1851, Maryland changed their state constitution to read this: every office holder had to make a declaration of belief in the Christian religion, and if the party shall profess to be a Jew, the declaration shall be of a belief in a future state of rewards and punishments. So it was the first time Jews could hold office in America. And then Lincoln was the first president to allow Jews to be chaplains in the military. Prior to then, they all had to be Christians. And then 1860 was the first time a rabbi was invited to open a session of Congress with prayer. His name was Morris Jacob Rafal. And then in the late 1800s, tolerance went out to anybody that was a monotheist. Our coins say what? In God we trust. It's God singular. It's not God's plural. You know, it's one nation under what? Under God. It's God singular. Right? So it was tolerance for monotheists. And then in the early 1900s, tolerance went out to polytheists. I mean, believe it or not, many state constitutions forbade citizenship to Chinese, Japanese, and others of Mongolian races. I'm doing my research, and it says, and no Chinese shall ever be a citizen of this state. I'm like, what is with this? Well, that's because they were assumed to be Buddhists. You know, the Chinese coolies that worked on the railroads and so forth. There's only 0.5% Buddhist in America today, and in the 1890s, it was just too strange. But they got to be tolerated, really not fully until after World War II. You know, the Asian internment camps. And but then in the middle 1900s is when tolerance began to go out to the atheist, the secular humanist, and the anti-religious, which makes it so ironic that the last ones in the boat decided it was too crowded, and they decided to throw the first ones out. So now there's tolerance for everybody in America except the ones that came up with the idea, right? Are you with me? I mean, imagine a sea of people drowning in persecution, and a lifeboat comes piloted by Puritans. They first pull out of the water their fellow Puritans. Then they pull out Protestants. And then they pull in Catholics, and then liberal Christians, and then Jews, and monotheists, and polytheists. They finally pull the atheists in the boat, and the atheist says, this boat's too crowded, and they push out the Christians. Imagine two little round magnets that are stuck together. At first, it's hard to pull them apart, but as you pull them and turn them, it gets easier and easier, till finally you turn them so much the backsides face, and what happens? The magnets repel. You know, it was real hard for those Puritans to tolerate other Protestants. Did you know the Puritans not only hung witches, they hung Quakers? 4 Quakers they hung as heretics. But finally, with the help of William Penn, the Quakers found in Pennsylvania. But here, at first it was hard for those Puritans to tolerate other Protestants. It was real hard for Protestants to tolerate Catholics. But then it got easier to tolerate more and more, till finally everybody got tolerated. Now, everybody's tolerated except the Christians that started the whole thing off. You know, I was doing my research and I looked at some polls. Did you know that Newsweek magazine, just September of last year, had a front page article of spirituality in America? Newsweek magazine said this: 33% of Americans are evangelical Protestants. 25% are non-evangelical Protestants. 22% are Roman Catholic, and 5% are other Christian. You add that up, that's 85% of America today considers itself some denomination of Christian. 2% Jewish, 1% Muslim, 0.5% Hindu, 0.5% Buddhist, 0.1% Unitarian Universalist, you know? And get this, only 1% atheist. Here, Newsweek poll says only 1% of Americans identify themselves as atheists, and 85% identify themselves as some denomination of Christian. I thought to myself, what do you call it when 1% forces its will on 85%? I think it's called a tyranny. When the views of the majority of the people are reflected, then it's a democratic form of government. We're not a democratic form of government anymore. We're not a constitutional republic anymore. It's an oligarchy. We're ruled by a few unelected judges. No, so I looked at the polls today, then I looked at the polls back in time. At the time of our country's founding, Patricia Benami is a New York University professor. She said 98% of the colonists were Protestant, which left about 2% Catholic and about 0.1% Jewish. So I asked myself the question, what would motivate this 99.9% Christian populace to want to promote tolerance of non-Christians? I came up with 3 reasons in my research. Do you want to hear them? Yeah. How many want to hear them? Yeah. Okay. The first reason, Jesus never forced anybody to believe in him, so we shouldn't. Right? There was one time when Jesus said something, and the apostles said, oh, Jesus, that's a difficult saying. He says, if you don't like it, you can leave. Now you contrast that to Muhammad, who had an army that rode into Medina and said, submit or die. And if you didn't submit, you died. If you did submit, he'd say, get your sword and your horse, follow me to the next town. They'd ride into the next town and say, submit or die. And if you didn't submit, you died. If you did submit, he'd say, get your sword and your horse, follow me to the next town. And they took over all of North Africa, all the Middle East, all the Spain, all of Turkey, you know. It was forced from the outside in, where Jesus was saying, no, true religion's from the inside out. You don't force people to believe. All right, it's like you grab a teenager by the ear and you make them say a prayer. Will they say it? Yeah. Is it pleasing to God? Well, probably not. But if they voluntarily say the prayer, yeah, then it's pleasing. So that's the idea that they had in America, that true religion is voluntary from the inside out, not forced by the government from the outside in. Now, that was the first reason why they tolerated people of other faiths. Now, the second reason was, who populated America? Were these Muslims that came over trying to tolerate non-Muslims? Was it Hindus trying to come over here to try to tolerate the lowest caste system? Was it atheists trying to tolerate? I mean, there's only 1% atheist in America today. Back then, there was none. You know, who populated America? They were Christians of Europe. Whether they were Protestants fleeing Catholic countries, Baptists fleeing Anglican countries, Mennonites and Amish fleeing Lutheran countries. You know, the Salzburger Lutherans of Salzburg, Austria, fleeing the Catholics when the Catholic. You know, each different one fled to America, insisting on the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. Once they got here, they said, you know, to be intellectually consistent, the same right I'm demanding for myself, I need to grant to these other Christians. In other words, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This was a Christian idea. And because no one Christian denomination had the majority, they had to learn how to get along with each other. I love the quote from Charles Carroll, the one Catholic that signed the Declaration of Independence. He said this: observing the Christian faith divided into so many different sects, S-E-C-T-S, sects. He says, observing the Christian faith divided into so many different sects gave me the assurance that no one sect would become so predominant as to become the religion of the state. This hope was early on entertained, thus I jealously entered into the revolution with many others. In other words, you know how we drive down the street and see all the different denominations and we think, oh, isn't this terrible? The body of Christ is so divided. They drove down the street and saw all the different churches and said, wonderful, free market. They're all going to be trying to get, attenders and members of their churches, and they're going to make sure that no one denomination will become so predominant as to have a majority and then force its will on the others. That was the only ditch they thought that was on the side of the road, was one denomination setting up their headquarters in the White House. They never imagined in their wildest dreams that 200 years later somebody would want to get rid of the very mention of God. Right? And so the first reason was Jesus never forced anybody to believe, so we shouldn't. The second reason is they understood do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. The third reason was the most interesting. Evangelism. Guess when the first missionary was ever sent out from America to another country? It was in 1812. Now, 1812 is a long time after 1776. 1812 is a long time after 1620 when the Pilgrims came over. 1812 is the first time a missionary was sent out from America to another country. His name was Adoniram Judson, was a Baptist who went to Rangoon, Burma. So prior to 1812, the common understanding of how you could communicate your faith to somebody of another faith was what? Was to allow them to come here and live in your neighborhood and hopefully have a little neighborhood evangelism, where they would get a chance to meet you and you'd be so nice to them that they would be interested in wanting to learn what you believe. So these were the three reasons. Jesus never forced anybody to believe, so we shouldn't. Do unto others as you'd have them do to you. And the evangelism. These were Christian reasons to the 99% Christian populace where they decided that they wanted to tolerate non-Christians, which highlights the utter hypocrisy today that everybody's being tolerated except the ones that came up with the idea of tolerance. Again, America was not founded by Muslims trying to figure out how to tolerate non-Muslims or Hindus trying to figure out how to tolerate the lowest caste system and treat them like a Brahmin. No, so this is important for us to realize when we look at the history of our country. And I wanted to get to this. So this is Robert Winthrop. He's the one that founded the Puritan, Massachusetts. This is Roger Williams that founded Rhode Island. I'm going through some pictures there. Here's William Penn. And William Penn, it's interesting. Can I tell you a little story? Of course, you're here and I'm talking, so I guess I can. William Penn's dad was Admiral William Penn, who was an officer for Charles I in the Navy and for Oliver Cromwell in the Navy. He fought against Spain and went down to the Caribbean and he captured Jamaica. And it's interesting because he set up a little fort there, and the fort was too far away from England to be defended. So as the years went by, the fort was the place where the privateers and the pirates would go, and they would rob the Spanish ships, and they would bring all their booty back to this Port Royal. And Port Royal got so debauched and such a terrible place. You remember the Pirates of the Caribbean? The place where they're all running around, And it got so bad that in 1692, God let a tsunami happen. And an earthquake hit, and Port Royal sunk underwater. 40-foot waves overswept the whole place. And today, if you go to Kingston, Jamaica, about 40 feet underwater are the ruins of Port Royal. It was the richest city in America. It was more prosperous than Boston. And anyway, just thought I'd throw that in. But that was William Penn's dad, Admiral William Penn, that captured Jamaica. And he defeated the Dutch. You see, Spain was so powerful that England and the Dutch fought together against Spain. Once the Spanish Armada was destroyed, the English decided, while we're attacking, let's attack Holland. So England, with Admiral William Penn, conquered the Dutch in the First Anglo-Dutch War. Well, Charles II, after Oliver Cromwell, they had a civil war in England. They chopped off Charles I's head. Oliver Cromwell was in. Then when Oliver Cromwell, his son was lousy, so they brought back Charles II, who was the son of Charles I that had his head chopped off. So Charles II is now back on the throne. And he wants to reward Admiral William Penn, but he doesn't have any money. So he gives him a bunch of background, some piece of land and way out in the distance place and in America. And so Admiral William Penn dies, and so he decides to give the land to Admiral William Penn's son, who was William Penn. Now, William Penn had disappointed his dad because he converted and became a Quaker. This was I mean, the Quakers were not liked at all. And William Penn, the son, had spent 8 months in the Tower of London. I mean, here he is, the son of this prestigious admiral, and he's in the Tower of London because he converted to become a Quaker. Anyway, he's let out, and King Charles II honors the promise to his father and gives him a plot of land over in America. So William Penn comes to America. He decides that he wants to buy the land from the Indians instead of taking it away. Now, if you contrast what happened down in Mexico, the Spaniards set up big estates, and they would have a Spanish lord would get this big plot of land, and whatever Indians happened to be on that land, he enslaved. And to this day, Mexico is a very small group of landed people, and the large masses of the poor, more or less Indian people. And it was begun at the very beginning. When William Penn came over, he owned the whole Pennsylvania. It was his personal property. But what did he do? He still insisted on buying it from the Indians. And so he bought the area for Philadelphia, and then he bought a little area of land somewhere else. And then, because he had been persecuted for his faith, he invited all the persecuted Christians of Europe and Jews to come to his holy experiment of Pennsylvania. And so they began to come. Do you know the first Catholic church in the entire English-speaking world was in Philadelphia in 1731? I mean, after the Reformation, there was none. It was in Philadelphia. And so William Penn allowed this to happen. It was an experiment of Christians learning how to live together of different denominations, because back before then, each colony was predominantly one or the other. And Philadelphia happened to be the city that we had our Continental Congress meet in. Philadelphia happened to be the city that we wrote our Constitution in. Philadelphia was the first capital of America, of the United States. And Philadelphia was founded by William Penn, who was a sold-out Christian. And I thought that you would appreciate that. How many like that? And you know, different presidents would declare different days of prayer. It's sort of like this. When things went bad, the colonists would declare days of prayer. When things got really bad, they would declare days of fasting and prayer. And then when the answer came, they would declare days of thanksgiving. There was a case when there was a famine, and they declared a day of prayer. The famine kept going. They declared a day of fasting and prayer. And then at the last minute, a boat of grain, a boat came in with supplies on it. They canceled the fasting, and they had a day of thanksgiving. And it was this idea that they were in a relationship with God, which means they weren't deists. Because a classic deist says that God created the laws of nature and then left. So why pray? Because prayer can't change anything. And so they were not deists. They believed in an interactive relationship with God. I was amazed in doing my research. I put together a book called Treasury of Presidential Quotations. Many presidents declared days of prayer. Many presidents declared days of fasting. Did you know that John Adams declared a day of fasting in 1799 during a threatened war with France? James Madison declared a day of fasting during the War of 1812. Lincoln declared a day of fasting during the Civil War. Even Woodrow Wilson declared a day of fasting and prayer in 1918 during World War I. But then we had different presidents that declared days of thanksgiving. Matter of fact, the first one was the President George Washington. Now, George Washington declared the first National Day of Thanksgiving the same week that we passed the First Amendment. So here, the First Amendment, which today is being used to get rid of God, the First Amendment was passed that same week. Washington declares a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God, thanking him for the First Amendment. And so you had different presidents declaring, but it was Abraham Lincoln that made it an annual event. And so every president from Abraham Lincoln until now has had an annual National Day of Thanksgiving to Almighty God. And I put those in this book, Treasury of Presidential Quotations. You get to read what Grover Cleveland said, and Harry S. Truman said, and Dwight Eisenhower said. They all declared days of thanksgiving to Almighty God. And it's interesting that they weren't thanking the Indians. I mean, they were thankful for the Indians, but their days of Thanksgiving weren't to just have a thing to thank the Indians. And that's what they teach in public schools. You know, this is James Madison. He's the guy that wrote the First Amendment. he should have a clue what the First Amendment meant. When he was president, we had the War of 1812. The British began to attack, so he declared a day of prayer. The British burnt the White House, so he declared fasting and prayer. We're getting serious here. They're burning our Capitol. And then when we won, he declared a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God. So here's the president that introduced the First Amendment, declaring 3 proclamations acknowledging God. Certainly he didn't think his amendment was to keep God out. You know what's interesting? The British charged into our capital on August 25th of 1814, and they began to burn the White House, burn the Library of Congress, burn the Capitol. Then the sky became dark and black, and the wind blew, and the wind picked up till it was hurricane strength, and it began to knock over chimneys on the British and knock over walls, and even reports were that it lifted up the cannons of the British and began to throw them yards away. And then lightning began to flash down and hit the British, and it began to hail on them. And one British commentator, historian, said more British soldiers were killed by this stroke of nature than by all the arms that the Americans muster in the feeble defense. And I think my microphone here is about going off, so maybe I'm getting a signal here. And anyway, so it was a miracle that our capital was saved. Then the rains from that hurricane began to put out the fires and extinguish them. Ladies and gentlemen, we are a country that has a heritage of God. And even Franklin Roosevelt, and I did a book on Franklin Roosevelt, he declared a day of thanksgiving to God. Franklin Roosevelt wrote the foreword for a New Testament that was given out by the millions to World War II soldiers. And Franklin Roosevelt had a day of where he acknowledged the 400th anniversary of the printing of the English Bible. And he said, we cannot trace our rise as a nation without reckoning the place the Bible has occupied in the advances of our republic. You know, in closing, I just like to remind you, someday you're going to be dead. So just thought I'd leave you on a little encouraging note. Someday you're going to be dead and you're going to be in heaven. And all you'll be able to do is talk about what you did on earth. I mean, the Lord will probably have other stuff to do, but I mean, I played sports in high school. I was an inside linebacker in football. And I used to sack the other team's quarterback so much that after one game they had interviewed the other team's coach, and he goes, yeah, that guy Federer was in our backfield so much we thought he was part of our team. And I went to the state finals in the high hurdles, 120-yard high hurdles in 1976. But all I can do is tell you stories. I can't go back and do it because I'm 49 years old. And someday you and I will be in heaven, and we won't be able to come back to earth because we'll be up there. But imagine this. Imagine when you've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when you've just begun. Imagine being in heaven 10,000 years and you get a chance to meet Moses. That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Walk along the streets of gold, you meet Moses. Maybe he'll invite you over to his place. Imagine you get there, and he probably got one of these fireplaces where the logs don't burn out. You know, get it? The burning bush didn't burn up, and the logs in the fireplace didn't burn up. And I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I said, I was thinking about something else. But imagine getting there and be a big room full of people like this. And as the evening goes by, you just can't contain yourself anymore. And you just say, Moses, what was it like? I mean, you're the guy. I've read all about you, but you're right here in front of me. What was it like being there? And he'll say, well, you know, when I was on earth, you know, Pharaoh and his chariots were charging in at us going 30 miles an hour with these razor-sharp swords, and they were going to slice us to ribbons, and I didn't know what to do, so I just held up my rod and said, God, use me to deliver my people. And the waves came down and destroyed Pharaoh and his chariots. And then we're going to look around the room and see David and say, David, tell us, what was it like being there? I mean, you're the guy. I've read all about you. What was it like? And David will say, well, you know, I was just 17 years old, and this guy named Goliath was mocking our God and mocking our faith, and the grown-ups were too afraid to do anything about it. They stood around for 40 days. And I said, if they're not going to do anything, I'm going to do something. So I go out there with my sling, and I hit him in the head, and I take his own sword and chop his head off. And then we're going to see the Apostle Paul in the room, and he's going to tell his story. And we're going to see Deborah and Gideon and Samson, all the great saints of old. Finally, the room's going to get quiet, and everybody's going to look at you. And they're going to say, you, tell us your story. What did you do when you were on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? What were they saying about the faith, about the Ten Commandments, about marriage that God instituted in the first part of Genesis? Tell us about what you did to stand up for the life that God created in the mother's womb. Tell us, what did you do when you were on earth? You know, I'd hate for any of us to be in heaven and Jesus to say, come here. And you come and there's a screen and you see all kinds of miracles and great things happening and throngs of people coming to the Lord. And him saying, this is what you could have done if you'd have been just a little more sold out to me. And realize you can't go back to earth and do another thing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you're still on the earth. You're still on the track, the football field. You're still there. This is the opportunity that you and I have, that you'll be able to talk about for eternity, what you do for the Lord in your life here. Well, I'd like to thank you for the few minutes of speaking and invite Vic back up. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for this, and have a happy Thanksgiving and honoring our Lord.
You've been watching a special program originating at a VCY America rally.